So thank you all for coming to this unusual adventure that it's a departure from our ordinary realm of the Minneapolis Theosophical Society meeting. I'm Susan Shopek, your host for this special program, and it's called the Women of Theosophy, coming to you from Unity South in Bloomington, Minnesota. This program is our gift as a thank you for all of your support through this past year. We're grateful for your attendance and your donations, and we wish for you a very happy holiday season. I wanted to share some birthday news briefly. We are days away from the 135th birthday of the Minneapolis Theosophical Society on December 17th. And it's noteworthy that our lodge was personally chartered by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky and Colonel Henry Steele Olcott. The charter document dated December 17th, 1887 shows their handwritten signatures. So that's pretty special. And if anybody wants to see it, it's on our website under the About section. We probably should have some confetti because it's the birthday, but oh well. Instead of our typical format, we're going to forego announcements and except to say that this is the last hybrid meeting, which is both in person at Unity South and over Zoom. It's our last one till April. We'll be switching back to Zoom-only meetings for January, February, and March. So the first half of this evening, we'll embark on a completely imaginary interview process with two extraordinary historical women from the beginnings of the Theosophical Society, Helena Blavatsky and Annie Besant. In doing so, we hope to bring them alive in your imaginations as having been living, breathing, passionate people who experienced vibrant lives and made a positive difference in the society of their time, and whose influence moved forward far into the future. In this process, we'll probably uncover new information not widely known to most who study Theosophy, but you can decide that for yourself after you hear the interviews. So this evening, we'll take a break at about 8 p.m. when we complete the first two scripted interviews and before we begin to talk about Dora Kuntz. And we hope to have some time for discussion at the end because the evening might spark some curiosity and further questions. In terms of our format, first, I'll introduce each segment with a biographical summary of each of the two notable women of Theosophy. Then I'll ask questions as if it were possible to interview them in current time as they look from our here and now vantage point back into their lives, regarding their lives then, and also we're going to do our best based on historical records to portray what their answers would most likely be regarding their lives then, and also what their views might be now about how things turned out with the efforts of their life's work. After the break, we will describe the fascinating contributions of Dora Kuntz, her contributions and her life, and she's another significant woman who contributed to the work of the Theosophical Society. We have two people who can tell stories from their experience of knowing her personally. Okay. So, even though you're all very familiar with HPB as the founder of the Theosophical Society, allow me to introduce her in the following manner, quoting from an article by Stephen Poehler. As a woman, she overcame the limitations her gender imposed on her in her time, and she became a fiercely independent, sovereign, and self-motivated person in her own right, never relinquishing these achievements in the course of her life. In her time, women and intellectual and spiritual callings were considered incompatible. Indeed, they appeared to many like fire and water. They were not supposed to mix. H.P. Blavatsky defied this mighty prejudice of her time. And continuing with the quote, secondly, she was a rebel against society as she found it, against religion as she experienced it, against conventionality and hypocrisy in all forms. Third, she was not a formally educated scholar, but an inspired person of knowledge. She was a technician of the sacred. She was the grandmother of New Thought, and she is the great-grandmother of the New Age. End quote. With that introduction of Madame Blavatsky, now we will move into our dramatization with Hope Scholes portraying HPB. And let us turn to Helena and Dr. Besant, who are having their evening tea. Welcome, Madame Blavatsky. I'll begin with questions for you. In today's terminology, how would you introduce yourself if you were going to describe your life and times?
Well, thank you. I was famous for being famous. People of my day knew my name, even if they didn't know who I was or exactly what I was about. In my lifetime, I was anything but a conventional woman of my time. After all, I was born August 12, 1831, and grew up during the unfolding influence of the Victorian age. I even wore red, something only acceptable for society women attending a charity ball at Christmas time. In fact, it was my unusual red blouse that drew the attention of Henry Alcott at our first auspicious meeting. Auspicious because we went on to work together the rest of our lives. The Victorian age of stuffy, dull colors of puffery and stuffed in dresses was not for me. And certainly not the wearing of black for widows. I've been a widow. I even wore men's pants in India for the practical ability to travel with ease. It's something that was completely unheard of for a woman to do. Though I am aware that it is commonplace in your time period. I also didn't hide my intellect, nor my sense of humor, as women were wont to do, indeed expected to do, and often, maybe by their husbands, required to do in the 1800s. And though pictures constantly showed me holding dour expressions, I was known for my outrageous and booming laughter. I loved to tell stories, and I could charm an audience and hold the interest of a crowd with my focused attention.
Oh, thank you. And could you please tell us something unusual about you that our audience may not be aware of?
The Russian, of course, was my native tongue. I conversed and wrote fluently in Polish, Greek, Dutch, German, French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and of course, English, which I learned from my governess as a child, and in fact also from my grandmother. Perhaps notable as well, as a child, I advanced well beyond my years and skill as a pianist. I had piano player's hands and the dexterity. As a young girl, I traveled to London with my father and played piano at a charity concert with Madame Clara Schumann, no less, and Madame Arabella Goddard, and a piece of Schumann's for 3 pianos. Also, at the age of 47, I was the very first Russian woman to be naturalized as an American citizen. And now you may have heard of me described as a Russian noblewoman, and throughout Russia, I was recognized as a countess. Now, though I never spoke of this in my lifetime, due to my currently being in the Scandinavian land of Minnesota, I will comment on my maternal grandmother's Viking roots. I lived much of my childhood with my grandmother, Princess Helena Pavlovna Fedya. Her royal line goes back to the Prince of Rus, from which Russia derives its name. Rus is the Old Norse language of the approximate year 800, and it means men who row, meaning those who so expertly navigated up the narrow rivers of the Baltic region in those Viking longboats. And I bet you didn't know that.
Thank you for sharing all of this. I think it's amazing you were the first naturalized Russian woman who was naturalized as American citizen. Here's another question for you, madam. You set out around the world very young, pursuing a life of comparative religious study in a time when women just didn't do that. Tell us how that happened.
I escaped on horseback by slipping past an armed guard in order to leave my 3-week marriage to Nikifor Blavatsky at the age of 18. He was 40 years older than me. Really, a domesticated life of any kind was never going to suit me. But with the financial support of my father, if not necessarily the understanding at that time, and not for many years after that, I left the Caucasus and traveled to Turkey. From there, I went to Egypt and Lebanon. My father may not have understood my psychic inclinations and abilities, nor my pursuit of spiritual knowledge from around the world, but he supported my right to engage my own mind and intelligence. I will say though, without the political and governmental power and status of my father's position, I most certainly would have been brought back to my husband by any country's Russian embassy. And if not to my husband, at least to my father. Remember back then, women were legally owned by their husbands. The laws have since changed. So then, before my 20th birthday, I was initiated into the Druze order, which was an esoteric sect in Syria. I studied the Kabbalah with the Sufis from the Chaldean Book of Numbers. I followed the instruction of my master and pursued the ancient wisdom around the world. I traveled to Greece, France, met my master in person in London, traveled to America, Mexico, Central and South America, and then India, and eventually Tibet, which was not easy to get into. I was able to take in the wonders of the ancient world, visiting many of the ruins and secret sites, which I believed all of these wondrous pyramids of the world were somehow connected. In the 1850s, I have to say I needed the technical status of being a married woman in order to travel anywhere, which you may not realize, especially in the manner in which I traveled all over the world. A single woman, even traveling with a friend, or with travel guides, or as with an assistant, just would not have been acceptable. In fact, arriving in New York, for example, I could not find lodging because hotel managers suspected me of being a woman of ill repute. Respectable single women had to get creative and rent entire homes together in order to stay in that city of New York, but really in any city for any length of time. Women only traveled alone directly to relatives. or with their husband, or with a male relative, or they didn't travel at all. But I made it work through sheer force of will.
Thank you. That's most fascinating. Madam, probably most of our audience has read about your military service, but do you have further details that they may not know about that time period when you were 36 years old?
Yes, of course, you must know, as I've told this story often enough, I love to tell this story, that in 1867, I fought under the standard of the great General Garibaldi in Italy, fighting for freedom from the Papists and the French. But I was not on his staff, as has been reported by some overly enthusiastic and dramatic reporters in certain newspapers, which in this day and age is probably called tabloids. For the rest of my life, I carried a musket bullet in my right shoulder, one in my leg, and my left arm was broken in 2 places from a saber stroke. I was left for dead and pulled out of a ditch, barely alive. I believe that coming so near death only heightened my spiritual development from that point on. Though I certainly paid a high price in terms of the injuries, particularly to my leg. I suffered a great deal of pain and swelling from edema in that leg from then on. I almost died from sepsis in that leg on June 3rd, 1875, and certainly would have died had my master not healed me overnight. I faced amputation of the leg at the young age of 44, but quickly even that drastic cure became useless to save my life. Instead, I'm told I went into a deeply unconscious, unmoving state, and my doctor, my second husband, and all of my attendants left me for dead as there was nothing left to be done. But then, to their great shock, I woke the next day with a healthy leg. The leg had returned to a normal color with no swelling in it, when it had been black and swollen to 3 times its normal size, only 12 hours prior to that time. After that, my health steadily improved throughout the month, thanks to my master.
Oh, madam, please, on to the next question. Please describe the scope of your work as an author.
I was well known for enjoying a cigar, or deftly rolling and smoking a cigarette. But today, I am carrying my trusty fountain pen. With it, I wrote Isis Unveiled, a 2-volume set of 1,471 pages, and then later, The Secret Doctrine, which was 100 pages longer, and whose completed pages stacked up 3 feet high. I later wrote The Key to Theosophy and the Voice of the Silence. Altogether, I published more than 3,500 pages of written work. And that doesn't take into account pages of edits and rewrites sent to publishers, and 700 pages of collected writing, still only with my fountain pen, and the volumes of articles in Russian, and for my magazines, The Theosophist, and my second magazine, Lucifer, and countless correspondences throughout my lifetime.
It is mind-boggling, madam, to imagine you writing all of that with your fountain pen. And what do you have to say about death?
I will say I felt absolutely no fear of death when it approached, because I had already had a near-death experience during the war. when I was left for dead in that ditch that I told you about. I had walked through the veil and back at a time when near-death experiences were not common and most certainly not commonly discussed, if at all, and certainly not by that name. As I wrote in the key to Theosophy, at the time, just as death comes, we see the whole of our life marshaled before us in its minutest details, showing us the whole chain of causes which have been at work during our life. We see ourselves as we really are. It is as if we are read, and we then read our life and view our life and understand the justice of life's experiences. As many of the audience will know, at the age of 59, I died of influenza. By then, I was weakened from kidney failure and would have already died 4 years prior to this had not Master M come and healed me, or at least propped up my kidneys enough so that I could finish my work. Of course, we did not have dialysis at that time in medical history, and so the poisons in my blood system tired me and wore me down. This underlying condition made me much more vulnerable to the influenza epidemic in April of 1891 that overtook London, and many others died that spring as well. The day after my passing, my picture in an article announcing this event graced the front pages of many major newspapers above the fold. If any of you even know the significance of that newspaper sentiment anymore, editorials were written from India, England to the United States. Now, I say this not from pride or even any attachment to the personality of this particular lifetime as HPV, but to describe the far-reaching attention that my work had already garnered by the time of my passing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And could you tell us who is someone that you're aware of now from your awareness outside of time, who is unusual or surprising to you that studied your body of work?
Maybe some of you know that Elvis Presley was a fan of my work. But did you know that he was introduced to my writings by his barber and studied the secret doctrine for years? He carried around the books of the secret doctrine, and they were earmarked and written in and beaten up because that's how deeply he studied the esoteric. His favorite book of mine, in fact, was The Voice of the Silence, which he could quote from memory, and he would read it. He would read from it and quote from it from the stage. And he also named his gospel group Voice as a reference to my book. It is known that he once asked his manager, out of all the people in the universe, why am I chosen to influence so many millions of souls? Indeed, his was a heavy burden, and he was seeking answers in esoteric literature, including from my books and many others.
Most fascinating. Madam, do you have a final statement regarding your legacy?
I do. I said during my lifetime to my staff and students, we are not working merely that people call themselves Theosophists, but that the doctrines that we cherish may affect and leaven the whole mind of this century. And looking back over these ensuing years, Since passing out of that lifetime where I was known as HPV, I can say with some certainty that this indeed has been accomplished for, I hope, several centuries. Now, in closing, as I know that you will next interview my esteemed friend and colleague, Annie Besant, let me say about her that from the moment I met Annie, I admired her pluck and her rare courage to come out and state her opinions boldly to the world. All along, it was precisely an eloquent orator that we lacked in our society, as certainly I myself could not speak at all in the public squares. And others, though they knew the material, they could not tell it well either. It was through Besant's leadership that the Theosophical Society grew in membership numbers around the world. And thank you, my dear friend.
Oh, and thank you so much, Madam Helena Blavatsky, for your kind presence here tonight. We are grateful. And before we begin our imagined interview with Annie Besant, portrayed by our Erica Kovet, I want to give you a bit of background on this powerhouse of a woman activist and the person personally chosen by HPB to succeed her in leading the Theosophical Society. After Madame Blavatsky was forced to step down due to her declining health. So we can begin with a tribute to Dr. Besant from G.S. Arundel, and he said, quote, "Let us look upon Dr. Besant, first of all, as a warrior. In the beginning of her life, she felt that she would be a warrior. At the end of her life, she knew she had been a warrior, that she was a warrior. I have at home a little piece of paper signed by her, Annie Besant, warrior. First, she fought with all of her power, holding nothing back, and yet she never fought for power. Second, she fought with all her genius, but never fought for fame. Third, she fought with all her fire, with a tremendous fire, but never to destroy. She fought for causes, for movements, for activities of all kinds, but not in order that they might triumph, but in order that truth might reign supreme." End quote. And now a brief summary of Annie Besant's life. Annie was Irish, and she was born October 1847 in London. Besant was considered to be one of the greatest orators of her day and was well known over the English-speaking world. Because of her ability to stir a crowd with her words, she built a career as a political reformer for social justice, education reform, and women's rights. Living in India as president of the International Theosophical Society, she became an early member of the Indian National Congress. In 1916, Besant launched the Indian Home Rule League, which agitated for Indian independence. She said of herself, An imperious necessity forces me to speak the truth as I see it, whether the speech please or displease, whether it bring praise or blame. That one loyalty to truth I must keep stainless, whatever friendships fail me, or human ties be broken. And now to our imagined interview, let us begin with our first question for Annie Besant. Welcome, Dr. Besant.
Thank you.
And please tell us a bit about your early life and how that shaped you.
Well, my father was a mathematician, well-read in philosophy, and he had outgrown the orthodox beliefs of his day. He did not hold conservative Catholic tenets, even though my mother was a devout Catholic, and I found comfort in those beliefs as a young girl. In my earliest years, I lived the life of a child in an upper middle class home. My father read to me often, especially poetry. I was close to my father and loved him dearly. But my father died when I was only 5 years old, and our situation changed dramatically. My mother was unable to support me and persuaded her friend, Ellen Marriott, to help care for me. Marriott made sure that I not only had a good education, but through her, I was given a strong sense of duty to society and an equally strong sense of what independent women could achieve. But even from a very early age, I instinctively supported the rights of workers and poor farmers. Too soon, I married and moved away from home and from my mother, whom I loved so dearly. My husband and I were ill-suited to each other from the beginning, as he was politically conservative, to my utter vexation, siding with the landlords, while I immediately and passionately sided with the farm workers, fighting to unionize, and these passions would shape my life going forward. A few years into my married life, what would ultimately separate us was my deep crisis of faith. I watched my 7-month-old daughter suffer from illness and almost die. The presence of pain and evil in a world made by a good God, the pain falling on the innocent, is on my own 7-month-old baby. The pain begun here and then supposedly reaching on into an eternity unhealed. A sorrow-laden world. All these rose up within me a bitter rebellion. I stopped taking communion as I felt I just couldn't call myself a Christian any longer. My husband demanded that I swear allegiance to the dogmas of the church, and I could not do so. This broke our marriage in the eyes of my husband, as he was a clergyman. Looking back on my marriage, I, like Helena, had a temperament not suited to the Victorian expectations of a passive wife, to put it mildly. I moved to London with my daughter. There I became noted for my radical political views. Soon I was a popular public speaker, giving lectures across the country. I championed freedom of thought, women's rights, materialism and secularism, and the rights of the working class, social justice and education reform to all who would listen. Something that wouldn't cause most of society today to bat an eyelash got me arrested due to the conservative religious sensibilities powerful in my time. I co-authored a book on the right to birth control. For that, I went on trial and likely would have gone to jail, but the case was tossed out on a technicality.
My, oh my. Thank you. Dr. Besant, as a woman, what inroads did you make politically as a role model for other women coming after you?
Well, when I was 38 years old, I was elected to the London School Board, even though, of course, women didn't have the vote in general elections. During my time on the Board of Education, I played an important role in helping the London dock workers form a union and gain better wages and actual job stability. The shipping industry had been dominated by the notoriously abusive system of paying only day to day at a pauper's day rate. With no guarantees, workers were forced to stand in line daily on a first-come, first-hired basis. I also worked tirelessly for better housing and educational reforms so that education was accessible to all children, including the poor. These are still important issues for our modern times, and I am more than happy to see amazing women following the same path.
Thank you. Moving from secularism and especially materialism to theosophy is quite a stretch. How did you make that leap, and was it sudden?
No, not sudden, but when insights came, they came upon me in a flash. As well as serving on the school board over 10 years of time, I started to expand my focus into spiritual philosophy. I became a Freemason. I was drawn to their belief that men and women should join together to work for a better world. I enthusiastically and with great energy, as was my lifelong style, helped found new orders of co-Freemasonry in Britain and also other parts of the world. I was happy to play this role in the growth of the Order of Co-Freemasonry because their meetings were not dogmatic. The meetings were open to both men and women with the goal of coming together, simply searching for the truth. And as busy as I was from the age of 39, there had been slowly growing up in me a conviction that my philosophy of materialism was not sufficient, that life and mind were other than and even more than I had dreamed. Then into the darkness shot a ray of light when I read A.P. Sinnett's Occult World, with its wonderfully vivid words, expounding not the supernatural, but a nature under law, that you might rephrase as the underlying universal laws of nature, which are wider than I dared to conceive. Theosophy would turn out to be a natural progression for me.
And so how did you meet Helena Blavatsky?
My friend, Mr. Steve, he gave me 2 very large volumes and asked me to read and review The Secret Doctrine, saying to me, "Can you review these? My staff reviewers refuse to touch them, but you are quite mad enough on these subjects to make something of them." I brought the heavy packet home. I sat down to read that night, and as I turned over page after page, the interest became absorbing. But how familiar it seemed, how natural it was, how coherent and how subtle, and yet how understandable. I was dazzled, blinded by the light. But the light had been seen, and in that flash of illumination, I knew that the weary search was over and the very truth was found. After writing my review, I asked to meet the author. When I went to meet Madame Blavatsky in her home, I found her seated in her large leather chair, receiving the nightly guests, engaged in easy, brilliant talk of her travels, but not discussing anything about the occult or touching upon the mysterious. What I remember is her piercing eyes as she spoke to me, as so many others have noticed about her. On May 10th, 1889, I became a member of the Theosophical Society and publicly announced my membership in the Star newspaper, and then gave 2 lectures at the Hall of Science to explain my reasons for joining the society. These lectures were necessary because of my notoriety as a materialist and secularist. To my secularist friends, it was a shock and a betrayal for me to join the Theosophical Society and to work for the organization. That I would even turn to a spiritual quest such as this was stunning to them. But to me, it was simply a part of my life's quest for truth in whatever form I found it. Following the philosophy of materialism is to believe that even consciousness is the result of material interactions, and thus there is no soul. And yet, undeniably, I had been wrong. Misled by intellect to ignore the soul, I know by personal experiment that the soul exists, that my soul, not my body, is my truest self. 10 years later, I moved to India and then served as the president of the International Theosophical Society for many years. Through my efforts and that of many others, the society continued to flourish and grow. Happily, though traveling abroad often, I remained in India for the rest of my life.
Oh, thank you for your answers, Dr. Besant. Thank you both. And I would like to close this segment before we take a break with this final quote from Annie Besant's autobiography. "In life through death to life, I am but the servant of the great brotherhood, and those on whose heads but for a moment the touch of the master has rested in blessing can never again look upon the world save through eyes made luminous with the radiance of the eternal peace. Peace to all beings." And now we conclude our interviews with these most amazing women. And we're going to, before the break, our next woman of Theosophy is Dora Kunz. And at this time, we offer a portion of a short video about her. We're fortunate to be able to actually hear her in her own words and her distinctive laugh. And thank you to John Samulik for creating and sharing this video with us. Then we'll take our short break, and when we return, we'll hear from John and from Von Brashler on their personal friendships with Dora Coombs. Thank you.
Before I do show you the pictures and talk about it, I've been asked some questions about my being able to see these chakras, etc. And many people want these chakras, etc. And many people want to do the same. Let me say this. This book, of course, I met Dr. Karagura in, I think around in the 50s sometimes. And we did this research around in the 50s sometimes. And we did this research work for some years. And she was very interested, and as I say, she was a neuropsychiatrist. She had a lot of connections with hospitals, and she was able, which is already an achievement, to let her go in, look at the medical records, and for me to allow to be working with her. Then I, of course, never in my life knew the names of anybody. And I wrote about chakras. I'll continue that. But how did I develop it? How did I get to know it? I'm, first of all, an old lady. I've had a tremendous lot of experience. This is the first thing I think one has to realize with this particular capacity. And I had certainly parents. I'm very, very fortunate in many ways, because I think so many people today have hung up about their parents. I can parents. They were extremely supportive and helpful to me at any time. So that I think has been a great help. And also, I will say this much about myself. After 8, which is which is unusual. But she thought the most important thing she could bring about in our life is that from the thing she could bring about in our life is that from 5 and 6 on till I left when I was fairly young, a teenager, she had us meditate every day of our life. So I think we got very early in our life. So I think we got very early in our life in the habit of concentration, etc. And I think that would help to take it as a matter of course. Everything what I ever said was taken completely as a matter of course, let me put it that way. Everything what I ever said was taken completely as a matter of course, let me put it that way. And nothing was said. I think that would give you a background, at least. And let me say this. My father was a man who thinks that he brought us up. My father was a man who thinks that he brought us up, his children, on the Socratic method. And the Socratic method meant that when you stated something, he would give you exactly the opposite point of view. We knew, it didn't bother us, anyone, because we knew perfectly well that he was completely accepted many things. But it brought me very early to suggest to the experience of you. And he was very curious and scientifically minded, let me put it that way. And my mother was the opposite. She was very interested in meditation, etc., etc. So I've had in my life, from early life, a balance, could I put it that way, in the influences of my life. I've met many people in the medical profession in my life, and I always am in sympathy, in other words, at the way I've been brought up, that at first, like Dr. Karagula herself, she didn't believe in anything of it. Am I making that clear? And that, I feel, is quite justified from their point of view.
And now we move on to Dora Kuntz. I'm going to give you a little bit of background info and then turn it over to Vaughn and John, who knew her personally. Dora grew up in a household in Java in the early 1900s in Indonesia. It was on a sugar cane plant run by her father. I think it's pronounced Karl van Gelder, a chemist. Both of her parents were members of the International Theosophical Society from their early 20s. Dora showed a clairvoyant ability at a very young age, and this ability was encouraged and supported by her parents. Dora became aware of the Deva realm, and given her theosophical household, her interest in angels and fairies was encouraged. She didn't just play with the nature spirits she encountered, she studied them, not just during childhood, but throughout her life. Her book, The Real World of Fairies, was a record of these studies. Dora married Fritz Kuntz in 1927. They established the Theosophical Retreat Center at Indralaya, called Indralaya, in 1927 on Orcas Island in the San Juan Islands near Seattle, Washington, and later Pumpkin Hollow Farm in New York. Dora taught workshops at Indralaya and Pumpkin Hollow for many years. She would go on to help develop therapeutic touch in the early 1970s, which is a holistic evidence-based therapy that incorporates the intentional and compassionate use of universal energy to promote balance and well-being. Dora served 3 terms on the board of directors of the Theosophical Society in America, and then she became president of the Theosophical Society in America in 1975. Notably, she has had the privilege of greeting and hosting the Dalai Lama when His Holiness visited the Theosophical Society in America headquarters for 2 days in 1981. And now with that, let's begin with Vaughn and ask for any reminiscences you might have about Dora. And also, Vaughn, tell us how and where you knew Dora and a little about what she was like.
It's a privilege to ever speak about Dora Kuntz. I would have to say that she was one of the 3 greatest women I've ever met, the 3 greatest people I've ever met, and nary a man is on my list. The 2 of them are Theosophists and 3 of them are energy healers. Dora is the most amazing person anyone probably ever met. I met her when she offered me a job on headquarters when she was still president there, and I came there and I was so excited. I got there early in the morning so I could start the day, and she was wearing a bathrobe and standing with her national secretary in the lobby, and the lights were off, and she says, "Goodness gracious, what do you want?" And I said, "I've come about the job," and I introduced myself. She said, "Oh, well, just sit here for a minute. We'll figure this out." And she moved me from department to department, and she decided that I really needed to be in the publishing house, not in the magazine production, and that I had to wait till Mr. Pedersen had left his job, and then I would come back and would certainly have a job. And so that was my first meeting, but it was not to be my last. I had the privilege of knowing and working with 6 of the last presidents of the national headquarters, and by far the most amazing was Dora Kuntz. She served longer than anybody, 12 years. And she kept coming back long after she was president there. and working whenever it was needed. I knew her from Camp Indralaya very well. I loved going to Camp Indralaya. She would have these wonderful evening fireside meditations. They have a huge meditation area there, and a huge fire pit, and it overlooks the ocean, and you could sit up there, and she would sit there, and we recorded many of her talks, and she said a lot of amazing things in those settings. One thing was, she would say, my parents, they never really worried about what I ate or what I did. She said, but the most important thing was that I had to learn to meditate. And she said, it's the most important thing anyone must ever learn to do is to meditate. And then, of course, she would teach these classes in therapeutic touch. And she was a natural healer. She helped co-found a program called Therapeutic Touch, which led to many other energy healing modalities that are popular today. It is taught to nurses. It is practiced in hospitals by all kinds of medical professionals and paraprofessionals. And, she personally taught something like 600,000 people, I think she said once, across the world. She said everywhere in the world, even in foreign countries, how to heal with their hands, as she said, to help her to heal. And I met her friend that she co-founded it with, and that was Dr. Dolores Krieger. And there's an interesting story that goes with that. She was trying to get Dolores, who was a nurse, into this energy healing. And it was important to her that somebody would give it credibility, somebody in the nursing, somebody in the medical profession. And she was encouraging her to not only learn the technique, but to teach the technique and become, to obtain a doctorate so that she could go and teach at New York University, which Dolores did for many years in a program called Frontiers in Nursing. But on one of their first meetings, they encountered something on a drive on the New Jersey Turnpike. Now, if you've ever been on the New Jersey Turnpike at rush hour, you know how busy that is. Well, they just hit the brakes, put the car to the side of the road, ran into traffic, stopped all the cars at great, risk to themselves, to rescue a little lost dog on the turnpike. They took that dog back and they practiced therapeutic touch on the dog. That was amazing, And well, as Dolores told me, she said, well, Dora doesn't heal like the rest of us. She said, she's a natural, She can see the aura. She can see the chakras. She can see the energy moving in the body. And she can actually diagnose what it is and correct it. And I know that's true because Dora told me that she would go into the local hospitals in Chicago, and there was a lot of Dora's work that was secret. Well, this is part of it. She would go into the hospitals because they would call her on the difficult cases. Now, the one thing that alternative healers are often told never to do is to diagnose. She would diagnose. She would study the patient in the bed, and she said, this is what it is. This is what you probably should look for, and that she would leave. And she was never there. She never took credit, and they would always follow up on what Dora had to say. Because when she would heal, she would run her hands sometimes on the body and sometimes slightly off the body, and she could feel the energy and she could move the energy. She could really do it. She dealt on a very deep chakra level that very few can do. It was very interesting to go to those fireside meditations with her at camp. she would tell you many things. I'm going to try. Nobody can replicate her voice, but I will try. She would say, Attic, come here, Attic. That was a call. That was a call to Eric Pepper, Dr. Eric Pepper, who she had listed to form a group through the Theosophical Society called, as I recall, it's disbanded now, the Theosophical Research Foundation. And they studied seriously the work that she would do as a healer. And they would validate the effects of it. It is an effect-based modality. She would always call on Eric to remind her of something or to go get something. And Dr. Eric Pepper, God bless him, he would be at her beck and call to make all of this, meaningful on a deeply scientific level. She would tell people at these workshops that there is some things you can do and some things you can't do. She would say you can use your hands to help and to heal. She said sometimes the best you can do is to hold their hand and try to help them through a difficult situation. She helped many people who were terminally ill come to their final days. She also would secretly go into the nunneries. She would visit nuns in the Chicago area, and she would teach these nuns how to heal with their hands. and that's something that the nuns didn't want publicized, and so Dora never talked about it, but she did it. She did many things. As a clairvoyant girl, Dora liked to say that she was the eyes of Charles W. Ledbetter. She was, of course, raised by young Theosophists who were kind of like two generations beyond, HPB, but, early Theosophists. And Dora would she would work with just about anybody that needed help. She would work with them personally and on a deeper level. Once when I was later working at the society, I said, we need a really great speaker that'll fill an auditorium. And they said, what do you want? And I said, I want to go and rent a room at the Marriott in Chicago, right downtown, and fill it up, like 300 people. I want to fill it up with people. And they said, well, Dora comes here, she gets a big crowd. Sometimes we get close to 100 people. I said, I want 100 people, and I want it public, and I want it in the newspaper. And we contacted Dora. She would just come at the drop of a hat whenever was required. And we said, we want to put on a workshop, an all-day workshop at the Marriott, and fill the place up. Well, it was hard getting a lot of Theosophists there because every nurse in the area wanted to go. We sold 299 seats. And I was out there trying to figure out how much tea that would be. And I counted it up. I said, well, we sold all but one seat. And at intermission, one of the nurses says, I have to leave. I'm so sorry. And just as she left, another nurse ran up and said, are there any seats? Are there any seats? That was our 300th person. So we filled all 300 seats. Dora would take you outside from the headquarters, and she would point to the trees, those big tall poplars that go up and down the 40 acres of the camp of Olcott. And she would say, do you see the landscaped angels? They're in every tree. I said, in every tree? She said, yeah. She looked, yeah, every tree. She could see them. She could see Davis. She could see fairies. She could see landscape angels. She says, well, they're there, whether you see them or not. You know, she knew where they all were at Indralaya as well. I was fortunate to work with her on a couple of projects at the publishing house. One was on the book with Dr. Safika Karagula. And that was an amazing book, The Chakras and the Human Energy Fields. It was like no other book that had ever been published. It was the most amazing book. It is a truly amazing book. Anyone who is interested in energy healing or alternative health, the chakras, should read that book. It is amazing. Now, Dr. Karagula died just before we put it to bed, as they say. So we put the finishing touches on the book. I remember working on that cover, which shows a chakra. And that was amazing. And then we decided that we were going to take some of her books and put them into audio cassettes. And like a fool, I picked up a classic, Christmas of the Angels. It's a little booklet. And every year we'd sell thousands of copies. People would send them as Christmas cards because it's a little booklet. And we said, well, we're going to do an audio version of it with music. And we got Tim Boyd, who's now the international president, to do the narration, along with Dora's secretary, Monica. And it was very nice. And then I got the great idea that we'd have to have some beautiful music. And we selected Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. Very moody. Sounds like the moon coming down, right? And I played it for Dora when she came to visit. And she said, that's a romantic piece of music. That's a romantic piece of music. Why did you select it? I said, well, it's very pretty. She said, I said, it's now associated with the moon and watching the moon. She said, I don't care. Later on, after Dora had passed, I would have occasion sometimes to visit the headquarters there in Wheaton, Illinois. And I spoke a couple of times on Thursday meetings. And I would always ask the people if they'd ever heard Dora Kuntz. They said, well, I couldn't remember. I said, oh, you would remember, because her laugh was impossible to ever forget. It would fill up the whole building. You'd hear it, from one end of the building to the other end of the building. And she was a teeny woman, very teeny. When she would sit in her chair, her feet would never touch the ground. And so she told us, well, I asked once, I said, you're working quite late into your life. I think John maybe will remember, but she lived to be 90 something. And she said, I have work to do. She said, I think that a person works until they no longer have important work to do. But I have work that needs to be done. So I'm still alive. That was a driving force. And she was absolutely a driving force. So I will leave some time for John, and then maybe we can answer questions about this most amazing woman, Dora Van Gelder Kuntz.
Thank you, Von. And John, so please tell us certainly how and where you knew Dora, and a little bit about what she was like and all the stories you would like to share.
Okay, well, I wanted to just take a moment and say how much I enjoyed, the presentation, with Hope and Erica. The costumes I thought were great.
Yeah.
And it was really delightful, to see them make that effort. And I really appreciate everything that Von said. I really don't want to take much more time because I think he covered it pretty well. I just say a few things, though, that, it was really one of the most important things that ever happened in my life was when I met Dora. And she was a team. It was Dora and it was Fritz. So it was Dora Van Gelder Kuntz. And she married Fritz when she was 18 years old. And she she moved to the United States, and as Vaughn knows, they founded, or, were part of the founding group of the Theosophical Camp Androlea, which is situated on Orcas Island, Puget Sound, between Seattle and Victoria. I see that Ray Torres is tuned in this evening. Well, Ray was the witness at my wedding to his sister in Victoria, British Columbia, on Vancouver Island. So glad to see that Ray made it this evening. But anyway, my introduction to Theosophy was Fritz and Dora Kuntz. And that happened about 1970. It was just about 2 years before Fritz passed on. Fritz was, quite older than Dora. She went to Australia when she was about 12 years old. She was born, in Indonesia, plantation family. And she went to, with her aunt, she went to Australia and lived in the Theosophical community with C.W. Leadbeater. And as you all probably know, C.W. Leadbeater was a very highly trained clairvoyant. And he trained Dora, with her clairvoyance. And she helped him a tremendous amount of, he was just in it, especially during World War I. All these boys were being killed in Europe. And, the mothers would write to C.W. Leadbeater, and they'd want to know, my son was killed in the war, World War I. And they wanted to know how their son was doing on the other side. And of course, Leadbeater was very generous with his time and tried to answer the letters. But after a while, it just got to be too much for him. So Dora told us a lot of stories about working with C.W. Leadbeater. She was a teenager, and she was writing letters, answering these letters to these mothers who had lost their sons in the war. But anyway, Fritz was 16 years older. Fritz traveled for years, with C.W. Leadbeater, serving as his personal secretary. And eventually Fritz would go back to the United States, and continue his education. But, in those early years of the 1900s, he was working very, very closely with C.W. Leadbeater. So there was this very strong connection between both Dora and Fritz and C.W. Leadbeater. And Dora was born in 1904, and if I remember, she died in 1999. So I met her 1970. Then about 8 years later, I drove to Chicago. They needed someone to take Jerry's place in the Department of Education. So I'm having a mental block. Vaughn, what was Jerry's last name?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, Jerry, it'll come to me. But anyway, Jerry was doing some wonderful slide programs. And this was before video, before VHS. So it bothers me. I can't remember his last name. But anyway, when I got to Alcott, I'd driven from California, stopped 2 nights, stayed in a Motel 6 2 nights, did it like 700 miles a day in 3 days in a 1973 Chevy Monte Carlo, big comfortable bench seat, right? So I got there at night, kind of similar story to what Vaughn had. I arrived at night, rang the doorbell. You know, it was pretty late in the evening, rang the doorbell. Who answered the door? Dora. So that was my, that was my greeting. And so she put me to work as the chairman of the Department of Education. And my number one project was developing videos. And we used a studio in Chicago for a while, but then we bought our own equipment. We bought video players. We shipped them, sort of like UPS type shipment to different groups around the country. So we were producing our own, videotapes. And of course, that program has grown tremendously. One of the people I knew and worked with was Steve Schweitzer, who's on the board of directors now. Steve lives in Florida, but he was on the staff, in Illinois for many years. So you tune in now to the website of the Theosophical Society, and you can see, the resources that are available through that website are just incredible. So, we've really come a long way in terms of, developing, the technology and staying with the technology as it can.
Oh, he's back.
Yeah, my Zoom dropped. That happens when I'm using the video. I could take the video off and it probably won't drop, but let's see if it doesn't drop anymore. But anyway, I don't want to say too much else other than, I did participate, in healing sessions conducted by Dora. In fact, at the headquarters at Alcott, we used the library, which is just a absolutely beautiful library. And I know Hope recently was able to visit Alcott and see the library. And anyone who hasn't been there, I strongly, encourage you to go. Back in the day with Dora, we had these programs, summer programs at Lake Geneva. And you all know you're not that far, really. If you're in Minnesota, you're not that far from, from Lake Geneva. And the George Williams campus is right on the shore of the lake. And so we would reserve that for a week and have our summer programs. But anyway, I don't want to talk on and on. I think Vaughn covered a lot about Dora. And all I can say is that I was absolutely fortunate to work with her, those 3 years at Alcott. So thank you, Susan.
Muting. Thank you, John. And thank you so much for making that video. That was really fun to watch. So, thanks, Vaughn. We're getting to know Dora a lot better. And I hope we do have time for some discussion and questions, and just another shout out to Hope Scholes and Erica Kobit for portraying HPB and Annie Besant so wonderfully, and to all who participated and all who are joining in. It's been a great experience. So, does somebody have a question they would like to begin with?
I have excuse me, I have a little information on Annie Besant. more than, they brought out. She was actually the first woman president of the Indian Congress. And she was the person that got Gandhi on the path to home rule in India. It was nobody else but her. And he was always very grateful that she steered him on that path. He was going to be more incremental in going down that path of independence, but she got him to think otherwise. So that's a very important thing. She was very important in the history of India and even the whole world, because that was a big influence on the whole world, because Gandhi's philosophy was used in so many of the change movements out there. And so she was a very important individual in the whole history of India, really. So that's something I want to kind of bring out there.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. I noticed that too. And really what happened is when I wrote this script of both of these women, I had like about, 4 times as much. And I read it out to myself and found out it was like an hour and a half and thought, oh, can't put that much in the script. So I had something about that, and then I had to take it out and just put it in her biography about the Indian Congress. But it's almost like you put Annie Besant anywhere and she is a change agent, powerhouse. Wherever she went, she made change. And anybody, it's worth your while to find out more about her, because she was just an amazing person in social justice. And then she moved to India and made amazing changes there too. Thank you for sharing that.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. This is Susan, I've learned so much more about HPB and Annie. As we mentioned early on, to bring them alive, bring them life to them, and not only recognizing their contributions, but just, feeling their presence, knowing what great sides we had to their character, and to, it's just so wonderful. It just helps me to really have a much better feel for these very important women who were part of the founding of the Theosophical Society. So anyway, who else would like to comment? And if you have a question you'd like to type in the chat, that's fine. I'll keep my eye on that too.
Oh, yes. Yeah, please.
I was just wondering with reference to Annie here, with the crossover with the Freemasons, I was wondering if there was more crossover or participation in both. And also with Alice Bailey, who would have been around during Annie's time, whether or not there's any crossover there with Alice Bailey folks and our Kingsville.
I actually know from talking to people over at the here in Minneapolis Saturate centers that there are materials from HPB that she dropped off and had interaction with them when she was here. So we haven't gotten over there to see what that is, but they did have interactions together in the 1800s. So that's fascinating to me. I think there was a lot of cross-pollination between all of these groups, because there was initiation connections too. That's a great question. It had to be, exactly.
Alice Bailey was part of the Theosophical Society.
Yeah, and there was actually just kind of a branching off too that happened with anthroposophy and And what's wonderful and beautiful is that it also has all come together too. Great question. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Either on Zoom or in person?
When Hope, Erica, and I were doing the prep for the program and on Zoom together several times, and Hope shared so many stories that she couldn't include in this one night. But Hope, do you have any anecdotes or short stories? You had so many. Sorry to put you on the spot, but
Oh, no, that's great. Sure. Okay, one thing I will say is I feel like some of the way this came together and what to emphasize and what to leave out was as I was waking up in the morning, this happens with me is, I have my own abilities psychically and stuff. And I had this intention to honor both of these women. And I felt such a presence, such a strong presence of maybe an archetypal presence, at least I would say, of Blavatsky. And I felt that there was a pressure to say this and to get that in there. And then I would hesitate about, well, should I really say this? Like, okay, there's only this one letter here that some people say this happened and others maybe refuted, but it was like, no, we're supposed to say this and we're going to get it on the record here, just sort of for the fun of it in a lighthearted way to say, well, no, this, we'll just put it in a script and it's unofficial, but it's almost like the expression wanted to come out. And then we were talking at the break that both of us felt their presence or some presence enjoying this and coming through. And like especially when I was talking about her leg injury, I felt a chill, like I felt this presence of, yeah, it was that way and it was powerful and amazing, to heal overnight like that, and be again facing death and then coming through, so the other thing that fascinated me is I use the term near-death experience because of what I found in the Keys to Theosophy. She didn't say near-death experience. I put that in because that's our modern expression of what it was, but she did describe, I believe, what she saw, because then when she described what death is like, it had to have been from at least a piece of her experience, or it was what the masters were telling her. But it felt to me like, nope, that was her experience too, where she talks about the reading of your life. It was so specific. And anyway, so that's one thing. I know there's more. Susan and I talked that we feel like there's more to this, and we just thought we're going to recruit Paul to do Henry Olcott probably, and he'll be the colonel because he has a beard, and I'm not an actress, but these guys are, and we'll make them do something else next year.
Yeah.
And, because it's fun to do a program sometimes, and I also have to say that I'm very aware that I did not realize that HPB was tall. And I'm only 5 feet tall, but she was broad-shouldered like I am. And I could only play her sitting down because I'm tall from the waist up and I'm only 5 feet. But she was tall and she was broad, and bigger. And she was a presence and she had this stare. And one of the things I didn't say in there was that she let Besant have it when she met her. And I didn't want to put that in there because it sounds sort of rude. But she let her have it. She just did that with people. She would look into their souls and she would say, run. And Annie Besant did not run away, but she just really told it like it was and told her what stuff she had to, she had to get her crap together in a way is what she was telling her, with this real deep reading of what was going on. And I think it shifted her because she was going to go to India and she was going to make a difference in a country, no less, So there's so much more in their interactions. If you look in the autobiographical information from Annie Besant and also the letters that came to light after their deaths too, it isn't just, what was known at the time of their lives. So it was a wonderful immersion for me to do this work, to get ready. And I couldn't even begin to put everything in that I could have,
Sure. I love the red blouse.
Oh, yeah.
And that she wore red. Yeah.
Against societal norms. I mean, that was another theme in her life. She did not walk, along, I don't know. It wasn't just that she was coming from Russia, because she would have been royalty that would be asked to conform for sure. But she just didn't have the patience for that, clearly. And I like that about her.
Mm-hmm. And it was fun to hear part of her personality could be so charming, especially when she was, telling her stories. And
Yeah.
because we know some other more serious sides of her as well. But yeah,
And you wouldn't know that from her writing, but the fact that she really could just hold people in the palm of her hand, and that she was so well liked.
Mhm.
She had to be, because there were other people in New York that she was able to be in these circles and for a long period of time. And that takes a charm. Takes a personality.
Mhm. Does anyone have a question, or I could ask one? Erica, I'd like to know if you have any comments about your experience as you worked with Annie and went over material and, edited some of it in your research and your experience with Annie.
Yeah, and I think most of it, because Hope prepared the script, and thank you. That was like amazing stuff. Thank you. So I didn't really do all that much research. I did a little bit, I dabbled here and there. But I think what really happened was on the stage, especially when you read the quotes, and especially the last quote was like, I felt like I wanted to cry. It just felt like this presence.
Mm.
And I think that's where it really came through for me. What amazed me about both of these women, and knowing some history of Minneapolis, that time era, women weren't allowed to do anything. And it's the time when they wore these heavy dresses, and the streets, they were boardwalks. They didn't have sidewalks, it was boardwalks, and the streets were muddy. And, the suffragette movement was kind of happening. There's just so much going on. And they had this perseverance. They were, I don't want to say they were tough, but they were just determined. They had, it was almost like that a life or death kind of situation. They just had to come through and do what they had to do, because that's who they were.
Mm.
And it takes a lot of, and I think, gee, could I have done that? Probably not. And I think that was kind of an interesting to compare, like, yeah, no, they just went out there and they did it. They didn't care. They knew it had to be done.
Long before Nike Just Do It came about.
Really? Yeah, the perseverance and the strength of will and the character of both of these people, kind of doing a deep dive of seeing what they went through and how much they really accomplished. Not to interrupt, but Blavatsky had these masters. She had a higher source that she was in contact with. I don't know if Besant really did, but she had this determination through her upbringing. That whole society is kind of messed up, and I need to fix it. But we're still working on it. But she really laid a lot of ground.
Yeah. I'm wondering. Sorry.
Oh, I just said there's a lot of divine work going on with them.
I'm wondering, from the group present tonight, does anybody have a comment on how the portrayal of, whether it's HPV or Annie or Dora, how it might have influenced their thinking about them or Theosophy, or what was interesting to you?
I'll share.
Oh, yeah.
My gosh, when you were talking, tears were coming down my eyes. Like, why am I crying? It's like, oh my God. I can feel the power. I mean, there were several beings here.
Yeah.
And I could really feel it. It was
Cool. So wonderful. That's nice to hear. There was certainly something going on.
Yeah, and it was such a calling to do it. It was irresistible. It was a lot of work, and we all did a lot of work to pull this off, but it was irresistible to do it.
Mm-hmm.
That great dress, I have to.
I love it.
Not mine. It was.
I had a dress from 1984 that fit her, and that's what that Victorian-looking dress was. Who could have thought, you know?
Oh, wow.
The scarf.
Oh, and
Yeah, it
that
was
scarf
perfect.
is my grandmother's from, I don't know, the
Oh,
1930s or something.
Oh, and my, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking of that scarf and my grandparents. My grandfather was from Russia and or Poland, Russia. I don't, back around World War I, you didn't know, from day to day. But my mother was very much into metaphysics, and I think it really, I think it came a lot from her father. I think there was a lot going on at that time period of a kind of an enlightenment, an age of a lot of information coming through. But you don't realize who in your ancestry was touched by that until something like this, until you go, oh, wait a minute. I remember that book sitting, in my grandfather's shelf, those kinds of things.
Mhm.
O hidden life, vibrant in every atom. O hidden light, shining in every creature. O hidden love, embracing all in oneness. May all who feel themselves as one with thee know they are therefore one with every other.
Thank you. That seems to round out this time. And it's just about 9, so we'll officially sign off. And we thank you so much for coming tonight. And again, such many thanks to those who prepared and participated behind the scenes, and especially to our Annie, Erica, and Helena, Hope for all of your research. Really was amazing how much research you did. So thank you so much. And Vaughn and John, thank you so much for helping us to get to know Dora better.
And Susan, thank you to you too for being on this journey with us. This has been, yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for being our wonderful hostess.
Yeah. Thank you. It was
All for being
a
And Paul,
delight.
thank you for being tech.
Paul,
Wasn't
And
easy this
Paul,
time.
yeah, that's what I meant by behind the scenes too, because there's a lot that goes on. Yeah. Thanks, Paul. And wishing you a very happy holiday, everyone. And